The text came in at 11:14 at night, while Frank Delgado was sitting alone at his kitchen table with a mug of decaf going cold in front of him, and the words on the screen hit him harder than anything had hit him since the funeral 3 years earlier. "Dad, so sorry, but Melissa really wants this cruise to be just us and the kids. Family time, you know? Maybe next year." He read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the sentence to rearrange itself into something that made more sense, something that didn't feel like a door closing in his face after 40 years of being the one who kept every door in that family open. He set the phone down on the table, face up, screen still glowing, and he sat there in the quiet of a house that had been too quiet since his wife Carol passed. And he thought about the fact that he was the one who paid for that cruise. Not all of it, not directly, but the money had come from him, funneled through a family trust he had built with his own hands over 30 years running an HVAC supply company. A trust that Derek, his only son, had access to for exactly this kind of family celebration. Because Frank had wanted his son and his grandchildren to have experiences he never had growing up poor in a two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Scranton. He had wanted to be generous without being controlling, present without being a burden. And somewhere in the last 2 years, since Derek married Melissa, generosity had started to feel like it was being quietly redefined as an obligation with no seat at the table. Frank was 68 years old, still sharp, still active, still driving himself to the gym 3 mornings a week, and still doing his own taxes with a yellow legal pad and a calculator, because he didn't trust software with numbers that mattered. He had built Delgado Climate Supply from a single delivery van into a regional distributor with 4 warehouses before he sold his majority stake 6 years ago and stepped back into an advisory role, keeping just enough involvement to feel useful and just enough distance to actually enjoy his retirement. Carol had been the one who kept the family close, who hosted every Sunday dinner, who remembered every birthday and every allergy and every small grudge that needed smoothing over before it calcified into something permanent. When she dies of a sudden aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon while gardening, the family didn't just lose her, they lost the gravitational center that had kept all of them in orbit around each other. Frank had tried to become that center himself, clumsily, the way a man who spent his life running a business tries to run a family, with schedules and generosity, and the assumption that showing up mattered more than knowing exactly what to say. For a while it had worked well enough. Derek called him every Sunday. His granddaughter Ivy, 9 years old, still climbed into his lap when he visited, and asked him to tell the story about the time he drove through a snowstorm to deliver a furnace part to a hospital that had no heat. His grandson Milo, 6, still thought Grandpa Frank could fix anything with duct tape and a screwdriver, which was mostly true. Then Derek met Melissa Ashworth at a corporate wellness retreat 18 months after Carol's funeral, and within 4 months they were engaged, and within 10 months they were married in a ceremony that Frank paid for almost entirely. $72,000 for a venue on the Chesapeake that Melissa had insisted was the only place that felt right. And Frank had written the check without complaint because that was what fathers did. That was what Carol would have wanted. Generosity was the language he spoke, because it was the only language he had left to say, "I love you and I'm still here and I haven't disappeared just because your mother did." Melissa was 34, sharp-featured, magnetic in the particular way of people who have learned exactly how much warmth to dispense and exactly when to withhold it, and she ran a boutique event planning and lifestyle consulting business called Ashworth Collective that catered to wealthy families in the DC suburbs, a business that looked, from the outside, considerably more successful than it actually was. Frank had noticed things early on that he chose not to examine too closely, because examining them felt like an accusation he had no right to make about the woman his son loved. He noticed that Melissa referred to his money as our family's resources within earshot of him, as though the distinction between his money and their money had already been quietly erased in her mind before anyone had agreed to erase it. He noticed that after the wedding, Sunday dinners moved from his house to theirs, then became bi-weekly, then monthly, then existed mostly as a standing invitation that somehow never quite got confirmed. He noticed that Derek, who used to call every Sunday just to talk, now texted, and the texts got shorter, and increasingly they arrived only when something was needed: a signature on a document, access to the trust for a home renovation, a cosign on a business expansion loan for Ashworth Collective that Frank had agreed to, because Derek asked him directly, man to man, over coffee. And Frank couldn't remember the last time his son had asked him for anything that wasn't wrapped in a request for money. The trust itself was the thing nobody outside Frank's lawyer fully understood, including, it turned out, Derek. When Carol died, Frank had restructured his estate with an attorney named Priya Chandrasekaran, a woman he'd worked with for over a decade, and the structure they built was deliberately conservative, not because Frank didn't trust Derek, but because Frank had learned running a business that trust and structure were not opposites. that the best way to protect a relationship from money was to keep money's rules explicit and unambiguous so that nobody's feelings could later be twisted around what was fair. The Delgado family trust held roughly $4.1 million in a mix of investments, real estate, and the remaining minority stake in his old company, and Frank was the sole trustee for as long as he was alive and competent, with Derek named as successor trustee and primary beneficiary, and Ivy and Milo as secondary beneficiaries with funds earmarked for education. Distributions during Frank's lifetime were entirely at his discretion. This was the detail that Melissa either didn't know or had chosen to forget in the 18 months since the wedding. Because in her mind, and increasingly in the way she spoke about family finances in front of Derek's cousins, and at dinner parties Frank occasionally still got invited to, the trust had already become an inheritance that existed on a timer, an asset to be managed toward, a countdown that an old man's continued presence at family gatherings was somehow standing in the way of. The cruise itself had been Frank's idea originally, floated 6 months earlier at Ivy's birthday party, a suggestion that the whole family take a real trip together, something Carol always wanted to do and never got the chance to, 7 days through the Western Caribbean, and Frank had offered to cover it through the trust as an educational and family bonding distribution, the kind of thing the trust document explicitly allowed for. Derek had been enthusiastic. Melissa had been enthusiastic in that specific way she had, warm and quick and full of ideas about excursions and dinner reservations, and Frank had let himself believe, foolishly maybe, that this trip was going to be the thing that pulled the family back into its old orbit, the way Sunday dinners used to. He had even started imagining it in detail, teaching Milo to snorkel in shallow water near a reef, telling Ivy stories on the deck at night, the way he used to tell her stories about the snowstorm and the furnace part, watching Derek relax in the way he used to relax before every conversation between them became transactional. He had booked his own flights to the port city 3 weeks in advance. He had bought a new pair of swim trunks, still folded in the bag from the store, sitting on his dresser upstairs while he read the text a second and then a third time at his kitchen table. What made the message worse than a simple exclusion was what it revealed about how the decision had been made. Because Frank knew his son, and Derek did not make decisions like this on his own, not decisions that required actively uninviting his own father from something his father was paying for. Frank had spent 30 years reading people across a negotiating table, distributors and manufacturers and bankers who smiled while they tried to take something from him, and he recognized in the phrasing of that text, "So sorry, Melissa really wants, maybe next year," the unmistakable fingerprint of a decision made by one person and then delivered through another person's mouth. The way people who don't want to be seen as the villain arrange for the message to arrive in someone else's handwriting. He didn't respond that night. He sat with it, the way he had learned to sit with bad news in business before reacting to it, because reacting from the gut had cost him money more than once in his career, and he suspected, correctly as it turned out, that reacting from the gut here would cost him something considerably more valuable than money. The next morning he called Priya, not to make any decisions yet, but because 30 years of running a company had taught him that the moment you suspect something is wrong with the structure underneath a relationship, you get eyes on the paperwork before you get eyes on the people. And Priya, calm as always, told him what he already half knew, that as sole trustee he had complete discretion, that nothing had been distributed without his authorization, and that if he wanted, she could pull a full accounting of every request and every distribution from the trust over the past 18 months so he could see the shape of things clearly instead of guessing at it. Frank said yes. He hung up the phone and sat in his study, the room Carol used to call his thinking room because it was where he went to work through problems that mattered. And for the first time since her death, he felt something other than grief animating him, a colder, more familiar feeling. The feeling of a man who has just realized he is looking at a negotiation and not a relationship, and who needs, before anything else, information. The accounting arrived 4 days later, and reading it was like watching a photograph slowly develop in a darkroom tray, the image resolving out of chemical fog into something unmistakable. Over the 18 months of Derek's marriage to Melissa, there had been 11 separate requests against the trust beyond the wedding itself, ranging from a $14,000 renovation of what Melissa called her home office and content studio, to a $31,000 loan to Ashworth Collective that was structured as a loan, but had no repayment schedule attached to it anywhere in the paperwork Derek had submitted, to a series of smaller draws, a luxury stroller system, a family photographer retained on what appeared to be a standing monthly contract, a membership to a private social club in McLean that cost more per year than Frank's own annual travel budget. None of these were catastrophic on their own. Frank had built a trust specifically so his family could draw on it for real needs and real opportunities, and he didn't begrudge Derek and Melissa a comfortable life. What stopped him cold was a single line item from 4 months earlier. a request for access to review the full trust documents and successor trustee provisions, submitted not by Derek, but by an estate planning attorney named Gordon Waite, whose retainer Priya's research quickly confirmed had been paid not out of Derek and Melissa's household account, but out of Ashworth Collective's business account, meaning Melissa's own company had paid a lawyer to investigate the mechanics of a trust that legally had nothing to do with her at all. Frank did not tell Derek what he'd found right away. He'd learned long ago, in boardrooms and warehouse floors alike, that the person who reveals what they know before they understand the full picture is the person who loses the negotiation. And this had stopped being, in his mind, a simple family hurt feeling, and had become something that needed to be handled with the same discipline he'd applied to every serious threat to his business over the decades. Instead, he did something that surprised even him. He called Gordon Waite's office directly, not identifying himself as anything other than a man interested in estate planning services, and booked a consultation under a slight variation of his own name, Francis rather than Frank, using a different phone number. Curious whether the attorney would even recognize the ethical tightrope he was walking by taking a meeting with the man whose trust his existing client had been probing. Waite, it turned out, ran a small two-person practice that specialized in exactly the kind of aggressive but technically legal maneuvering that wealthy families' more ambitious in-laws sometimes sought out. Structuring gift requests to look like emergencies, timing distribution asks around emotionally vulnerable moments, drafting soft pressure letters designed to make a trustee feel that refusing a request would look petty or cold in front of the rest of the family. Frank sat in that consultation for 40 minutes, listening to a stranger describe, in general and hypothetical terms, exactly the kind of campaign that had apparently been quietly run against him for the better part of a year and a half, and he left with something he hadn't expected to get that day, which was clarity, cold and complete, about what he was actually dealing with. He still might have handled it privately, might have simply tightened the trust's discretionary language with Priya, and quietly declined future requests without ever confronting anyone directly, if not for what happened 2 weeks later, when Ivy called him crying. She was 9, old enough to sense when something in a household had shifted, but too young to fully understand what she was sensing, and she told her grandfather, in the halting way children tell you things they've overheard and weren't supposed to repeat, that she'd heard her mom on the phone saying that, once Grandpa's money finally came through properly, they wouldn't have to deal with him coming around so much anymore, and that Milo had asked their mom what that meant, and their mom had told him not to worry about it, and Ivy wanted to know if Grandpa was going somewhere. Frank told his granddaughter that he wasn't going anywhere, that he loved her more than almost anything in the world, and after he hung up the phone his hands were shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since the morning Carol died. Except this time the feeling underneath the shaking wasn't grief, it was fury, controlled and precise, the specific fury of a man who has just understood that someone has been quietly, patiently, strategically working to erase him from his own family's life while spending his money to do it. He didn't confront Melissa. He didn't confront Derek either, not yet, because he understood something important that took him another 2 days of sitting with his anger to fully articulate to himself, which was that Derek was not his enemy, not really. Derek was a man who had lost his mother and then fallen in love with someone skilled at filling the specific emptiness that grief leaves behind. Someone who had made herself indispensable to him in exactly the ways Frank, wrapped in his own grief, had failed to be indispensable in those first raw months after Carol's death. Punishing Derek the way he wanted to punish Melissa would only prove to his son that his father really was the cold, transactional, easily depicted figure Melissa had apparently spent 18 months quietly constructing in Derek's mind. So Frank did what he had always done best, which was build a plan with more patience than anyone expected from him, a plan that would not require him to raise his voice even once. He started by fully funding, in advance and without asking anyone's permission, 2 separate education accounts for Ivy and Milo, moving a significant portion of the funds that had been earmarked for them within the trust into 529 accounts that were legally protected and irrevocable, accounts that no future trustee, successor or otherwise, could ever redirect toward anything but the children's education, a move that took 11 days to execute properly with Priya, and that gave Frank a strange, quiet peace even before anything else happened. Because whatever else occurred, his grandchildren's futures were now genuinely untouchable. Then he had Priya draft but not yet send an amendment to the trust that would remove Derek as successor trustee and replace him with a corporate trustee, a bank trust department that would administer the trust according to strict, unemotional rules after Frank's death, with distributions to Derek structured as a fixed quarterly income rather than a lump sum inheritance, the kind of arrangement Frank had seen work well for other business families, where a beneficiary spouse posed what estate attorneys delicately called a stewardship risk. This amendment was not vindictive. It was, if anything, the single most protective thing Frank could do for his son, because it meant that whatever happened in Derek's marriage, whatever Melissa's business needed or wanted in the years ahead, there would be a wall between her ambitions and the entirety of the Delgado family's financial future. A wall built, not out of anger, but out of the same discipline that had kept Frank's company solvent through 2 recessions. The final piece of the plan required something Frank hadn't done in years, which was to go around a closed door directly rather than wait to be let back in. He called Derek and asked him to come by the house alone, just the 2 of them, no explanation given beyond that it was important. And when Derek arrived looking wary and a little defensive in the particular way people look when they suspect a conversation is going to be uncomfortable, Frank didn't start with the Crews, and he didn't start with Melissa. He started by putting the full trust accounting on the kitchen table, the same table where he'd read the text message weeks earlier, and he asked his son to read it, all of it, without interruption, and to tell him honestly, as a grown man and not as someone's husband, whether he had known the full scope of what had been requested and spent in his name over the last 18 months. Derek read for nearly 20 minutes in silence, and Frank watched something happen to his son's face that he recognized because he had felt it happen to his own face, reading the same documents days earlier. The particular expression of a person realizing that a story they'd been telling themselves about their life did not match the evidence sitting in front of them. Derek hadn't known about the Ashworth collective loan structured with no repayment terms. He hadn't known about Gordon Waite's retainer, or the inquiry into successor trustee provisions. He'd known about some of the smaller draws, had rationalized them the way people rationalize things when confronting them would mean confronting a larger truth about their marriage. But he had not known the shape of the whole pattern, and seeing it laid out chronologically, request after request, each one slightly larger and slightly less connected to genuine need than the last, did something to him that no lecture from his father could have accomplished. Frank told him gently but without softening the substance of it, what Ivy had said on the phone, and watched his son's composure genuinely crack for the first time since Carol's funeral. He told Derek about the education accounts, framing them honestly as something he'd done to protect Ivy and Milo regardless of what happened next in the family. Not as a threat but as a fact already in motion. And then he told Derek about the trust amendment sitting drafted and ready with Priya, explaining, in the same measured tone he used to use explaining a difficult business decision to his management team, that this wasn't punishment, that he loved Derek exactly as much as he had the day he was born, but that love and financial discretion were 2 different things, and that a father's job, even a father of a grown man, was sometimes to build guardrails that a son in the middle of his own life couldn't clearly see he needed. He told Derek he wasn't sending the amendment yet. He told him the decision about what came next, about what kind of marriage he wanted, about what kind of father he wanted to be to Ivy and Milo, about what role, if any, Melissa's ambitions would play in the family's financial future going forward, belonged entirely to Derek, and that Frank would respect whatever his son decided, but that he would no longer fund a version of the future in which he had been quietly written out of his own family's story to make room for someone else's timeline. The confrontation that followed between Derek and Melissa happened in private, and Frank never learned every detail of it, only the outline Derek gave him weeks later over coffee. An outline that included Melissa's fury when she learned Frank had spoken to Gordon Waite's office, her insistence that she had only ever been advocating for her own family's financial security, and Derek's realization, arrived at slowly and painfully over several difficult conversations, that his wife's definition of family security had somehow never once included the man who'd paid for their wedding, funded their home renovation, and cried real tears calling his granddaughter back to reassure her that he wasn't going anywhere. Melissa did not disappear from the family, and Frank never wanted her to. He wanted, if anything, for her to understand that the family she'd married into came with its patriarch fully intact, watchful, and financially sober about exactly what generosity did and did not obligate him to provide indefinitely. The trust amendment was sent to Priya's office for filing 4 months after that kitchen table conversation. Not out of anger but as a permanent structural decision Frank had concluded was simply the wisest way to protect 3 generations of his family regardless of any single marriage future. And when Derek was informed of the final terms, quarterly distributions instead of discretionary access, a corporate trustee with no emotional stake in anyone's home renovation plans, he told his father it was fair, more than fair, and thanked him quietly for loving him enough to say no. The cruise, ironically, never happened, not that year and not the year after, because by the time the original sailing date arrived, Derek and Melissa were in the middle of a 6-month separation that began, according to the outline Derek gave his father, on the night Melissa suggested they simply stop involving Frank in major family decisions going forward, and Derek, for the first time in 18 months, told her no. Frank did not celebrate the separation, and he told his son honestly that he hoped, whatever happened, that Ivy and Milo would grow up in a home with two parents who loved them well, together or apart. What Frank did celebrate, quietly, in the privacy of his own thinking room, was something smaller and more durable than any single relationship's outcome. The knowledge that his grandchildren's education was now permanently protected, that his family's core wealth would never again be treated as a countdown clock by anyone who married into it, and that he had gotten there without raising his voice, without threatening anyone, without doing anything Carol would have been ashamed to watch from wherever she was now. A year later, on a bright October Saturday, Frank took Ivy and Milo to the aquarium, just the three of them, and standing in front of a massive tank full of drifting jellyfish, Ivy asked him, out of nowhere, whether he was ever going to take that cruise he used to talk about. Frank smiled and told her that he'd already had the best trip of his life right here, watching her grow up close enough to still climb into his lap and ask him questions, and that everything else, every excursion and every reef and every deck full of stars, was just details he could get to later, on his own terms, whenever he was good and ready. Because the thing he'd almost lost was never the vacation at all. It was this, the simple ordinary right to still belong in his own family story. And no text message, no matter how it was phrased or who had written it, was ever going to take that away from him again.